The first thing that I'm going to be doing to make my crystal slab tray is by making up my crystal embeds. And I'm going to be doing that by mixing up a few different items together to create this sort of crystal dust. And what I'm mixing up is some Epsom salts. I've got some white beach sand. I'm also going to be adding in just a shimmer mica powder. And then as well, I'm going to also be using some artificial snow, which I got from Kmart, but another really good option if you can't get a hold of this is the glitter glass chips. With my crystal mix, I don't really do any sort of exact measurements. I kind of just see how it looks and decide whether I need to add more sand or more mica powder before adding in the resin. When I add in the resin, I just do a little bit at a time. I still want this to be quite dry. I don't want it to be completely soaked through with resin. So I add a little bit in, give it a really good mix, and I kind of want the same texture as wet sand. So I still want it to have quite a rough texture and not turn into like a liquid with too much resin. So just like this, where it clumps together and it will hold its shape, but it still is really textured to it. Now in just a silicone mold, you could also just do this on some baking paper. I'm going to start by making a crystal shape. I want this to look like a geode that has been cut in half, so I'm building it up on the outer edges and making sure it dips into the center. I let that dry for 24 hours, and once it had completely set, I then removed it from the silicone mold and placed it into my Geode mold tray. And then I'm also adding in some more of that crystal mixture around the edge of that, so that way it's going to hold it into place. And I'm also going to be spreading it out a little bit more so it's not too perfectly symmetrical, and I've got little bits of crystal sort of fading from the center going out, and adding a little bit more resin so that way it's going to hold into place when I do start pouring my first layer of resin. I left this for a good few hours before I started to do my first layer of resin, just because I didn't want any of those crystals to float around in the first layer. I wanted them to stay where I placed them. And now I'm mixing up my colors. So I've got a few cups set out with my pre-mixed resin, and I'm just adding the colors in. One of the whites is going to be a bit more stronger, so I've added about 4 to 5 drops in. And then in my second white that I'm doing, it's going to be more translucent. I want it to be quite soft, and that's only got 2 drops in. And then I've also added a little bit of a shimmer pearl powder, a very small amount, into another of my cups of resin, just to give a tiny bit of shimmer to this piece, but I don't want it to be overly sparkly. And then I've also mixed up this brown amber tone, which was honey brown tint from Barnes, and then I added a drop of white into that to make it more solid, opaque than translucent. Now with my translucent white and my pearl, I am pouring that down onto my mold, and I'm just kind of pouring in puddles, pouring over the top, because I want this to kind of flow and move and create some really organic patterns. I don't want it to be too precise or perfect, so I'm just kind of pouring it wherever I want some white or some pearl. And then I'm going to start to move my tray around and blend that out, soften it out using my heat gun, and just picking up the tray and moving that, so that way the resin just starts to flow and blend together. Then I waited about 15 minutes before I did this next step. So this is the white that I added more white to, so it's going to be a stronger, more solid color, opaque white. So I think this had the 5 drops in it compared to the one that I poured at the bottom that only had 2 drops. And I'm using my paddle pop stick to pick up my resin and to drag it through, going in one direction, and this is going to start creating my fractured lines of my crystal. The reason why I did wait about 15-20 minutes before I started to do my fractured lines is because I don't want them to sink straight to the bottom. So by allowing my resin to start to cure, get a bit thicker, it means that when I do add these fractured lines on top, they're not going to go straight to the bottom and pull all down at the bottom. And they would do that because there is more pigment in this resin than in the other 2 resins that I've already got in the mold, so therefore it's going to sink to the bottom because it's more dense. But if I wait for the resin to get thicker. It doesn't give it the chance to sink to the bottom because the resin has already started to cure a little bit. Now, depending on the type of resin you're using and the temperature of your room, your timing for that might change. So I was using a more slower setting resin, so therefore I can give it a really good amount of time before I started to add my fractured lines in. When I had some of my white fractured lines down, I then went in with my amber tone colored resin, and I just did that in a few key areas as I kind of want it to be more of a feature to my crystal slab serving board. So I only did that in those key areas. After I did that, then I went back over again with some more white fractured lines. I'm doing all of these for the first layer going in pretty much the same direction. So I'm not going straight across them. I'm going completely in one direction while I'm doing this. So going from me outwards. With the same amber colored resin that I've already mixed up, I'm adding a very, very small amount of black to that just to help darken it. And then I'm going to be going straight back over the top of where I did the first lot of my amber toned fractured lines. And I'm just going to be adding a little bit in. So I don't want to completely cover the fractured lines I did before, but I just kind of want to add a little bit of depth to it and a little bit more interest, because if you ever look at crystal and their fractured lines, they'll have like multiple colors in the one fractured line. So by just darkening it slightly and going back over the top, it will just give it a little bit more of that wow factor. Then I let that first layer completely set, and I'm going to start the exact same process again. So I'm just pouring that same sort of translucent white as well as that really, really subtle pearl color through my resin, and just pouring that all over really randomly and then blending that out using my heat gun to pop any bubbles that might be in the resin. And then I'm going to let that sit for another 15 minutes before I start coming back on in to do my white fractured lines. So my resin is a bit thicker and I'm coming back in to do some more white fractured lines, and this is with, once again, that thicker opaque white than that translucent white. So this is the one that has 5 drops in it, and this time I'm going to be going in a different direction to what I did for my first layer. And that's also the reason why I am doing multiple layers to create this effect, because I do want to have depth to this piece and I want to be able to see lots of layers. If you ever look at crystals really closely, you can see all these like layers and detail and lines going in different directions. So by doing your resin in multiple layers, it will create that same effect. And I ended up doing 3 layers in total and just let them set between each one. So you can see here I'm on my very last layer and I'm just doing all of the exact same things again. When my final layer was fully cured, I could then demold it from my mold, and the bottom looks pretty cool as it is, but I was really happy with how this turned out. So the fractured lines look really realistic. I'm really happy with how the crystals are looking. Now the mold I use is a matte finish mold, and I want this to be glossy, so I'm just going over it with my orbital sander, and I'm going to give that a really good sanding back before I top coat it. So this was an 800 grit, and I sanded it all over, making sure that that was nice and roughed up, so that way when I do add my top coat, it's going to grip really well. Then before I do top coat it, I do like to wash it off with some water, get rid of all of that dust from sanding, and I've taped up the back, and now I've placed it up on cups, and I'm going to be going over the top with my top coat. So the top coat that I am using is from Icoat epoxy, and I'm really liking their top coat, and I'm just placing that all over so that way I have a really beautiful glossy finish to this piece. And the very last step to finish my crystal slab piece is to add a metallic border. I really like it when you see like the crystal display trays and they've got a metallic border to them. I think it looks really beautiful. I'm going with gold because I think it's going to match in really well to the amber tones. And I'm using a 24 karat gold liquid metal pen. I'm pretty sure this one is from Krylon, and I do end up doing 2 coats. So I do the first coat and then just go back over it, just because sometimes it can be a little bit streaky, and I find this is a really easy and effective way to add that metallic gold border. And this is the finished piece. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I think it looks pretty realistic considering it is resin, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And obviously you can take this same technique and do whatever color combination you like. I feel like this technique would do really well with a rose quartz sort of color combination. And like always, if you like this tutorial and you found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up. It really helps me out. And if you are new to my channel, please do subscribe, as I post new videos every single week. And don't forget to check out my resin playlist if you are interested in more resin tutorials.